Thank you guys so much. You have been such terrific participants because everybody's here. It's great to see so many of you. And really, we are really appreciative of the attention you all have been showing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kara O'Connor, who is AFT's Midwest Farmland Protection Manager. And we're going to start off with a session thinking about ecosystem service markets, and Tyler Miller talking about some innovative work that Vermont Land Trust has been doing with a SIG grant. So Kara, to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm really excited about the sessions for today. We have some great speakers and panelists in store for you. And just to sort of recap where we've been and where we're going, we've learned so much about the science of soil health and communicating about soil health over the past 2 days. And this morning, we're going to have a couple of great sessions that will dive deeper into the question that we began to talk about yesterday, how to pay for soil health practices. So as we learned from the soil health case studies on day one, some farmers will pay for soil health practices themselves, either because they think it's the right thing to do or because they see the economic benefits, either in increased yields or reduced input costs. But others, farmers and landowners, are going to be looking for financial resources to bring new soil health practices into reach on their farm. And so, as we talked about yesterday afternoon, there are federal and state programs that are resources for you and for those farmers and landowners to consider. We want to continue to explore that topic and basically give you as many different options in your toolbox for thinking about how do we pay for soil health practices. So I am really excited in this session to have Jean Brokish and Tyler Miller with us. Jean is my Midwest colleague at American Farmland Trust. She is the Midwest Program Manager. And in that capacity, she works with the Illinois Sustainable Agricultural Partnership and a couple of our watershed projects in Illinois. Tyler Miller is the Vice President for Stewardship at Vermont Land Trust. And in that capacity, he's working directly with farmers and landowners, stewarding and monitoring easements, and also working on some really innovative projects that one of which he's going to dive into today. So Jean, we'll start with you and take it away.
All right, I think I shared my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, great. Well, thank you for letting me join this party. I'm excited to be part of this. I actually worked at a land trust in Southwest Michigan for a while, and so it's the work you all do is near and dear to my heart. As Kara mentioned, I'm the Midwest Program Manager for American Farmland Trust, and I'm based out of my home office near Champaign, Illinois. And over the past year or so, I've been working closely with my colleague, another AFT Midwest staff member, Dr. Emily Bruner, to develop materials and that will really help farmers and conservation professionals understand this thing we're calling ecosystem markets. With that, I'm going to get into this a little bit here and just explain what are ecosystem markets. In a nutshell, it is an exchange between an entity that produces some sort of greenhouse gas and one that reduces a greenhouse gas. So it's just like any other marketplace. These have developed over the last, 15 years and really have accelerated in the last 3 years in response to consumer demand. Multiple corporations, everything from Walmart to Microsoft to Fat Tire Brewing Company, have made sustainability pledges in response to that consumer demand. And essentially what they're doing is they're allowing, the market allows a company to pay other beneficiaries or other beneficiaries to pay landowners or land managers to protect, restore, or mitigate those impacts to the ecosystem. A lot of times we're talking about practices like cover crops, no-till, nutrient management that are already part of traditional or state or federal cost share programs. But in this case, we're looking at the outcomes, like what are the environmental benefits? What are the greenhouse gas reductions? That's what the payment rate is based on, not so much an acre, like an acre-based incentive that you might see through an EQIP or a Farm Bill program. There are multiple active and pilot markets exist for greenhouse gas reductions, carbon sequestration, water quality, water quantity, as well as wetland habitat, biodiversity. Generally, they're all lumped together and thinking about carbon markets, but it's beyond carbon. So I just want to toss that out there for context for you all. In an ideal world, carbon markets would be an economic driver for conservation practices, so we'd really like to see them being open to all farmers, regardless of farm size or production system. We'd love it to be fair for all farmers, regardless, again, of farm size or production system. The credits that we're selling, the things that we're putting on the marketplace, they need to be real and they need to be verifiable. So lots of entities are using a carbon registry and some best practices are being developed for that. It would be transitional for the economy. It would actually create, it would be an economic driver and it would create economic opportunities. And then it would be designed for permanence with different safeguards in place. So a little footnote on one of these, the whole open to all and the fairness for farmers, there's a little bit of a rub right now in how markets are being rolled out, where there's a thing called additionality. So farmers and the markets are designed for a change in management. So a farm who's been doing soil health practices for 10, 15 years cannot participate in the markets as they are structured right now, because the markets are designed for baseline and a change. And so if the baseline is already cover crops and no-till and soil health practices, we're not getting that additionality, and therefore those farmers can't participate. The marketplace is really looking at these carbon offsets again. So those are measurable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. They are used to compensate. We're actually compensating, somebody to reduce those emissions. And then we're typically using a unit of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's where I think the term generally gets generalized to be carbon. But it includes carbon dioxide, it includes methane, and it includes nitrous oxide. Just really quick, an overview of greenhouse gas emissions from the country in 2019. Vast majority on the left here, you can see the carbon dioxide makes up the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by methane, nitrous oxide, and then a little bit of fluorinated gas at about 3%. On the right are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. In 2019, again, transportation, electricity, and industry make up large pieces of the pie. Agriculture is only 10% of the pie. So it's not at all the largest contributor of greenhouse gases. I think that's really important to understand as we're talking with farmers. We are not blaming farmers for greenhouse gas or climate change. We are simply, they are a part of the puzzle though, and they are the part of the puzzle that I think has one of the greatest opportunities to actually be a carbon sink. So that's why we're focusing on them today, as well as many of the markets that are in play. Looking at just kind of the landscape here, this is an overview of the national location of where cropland acres are that would be eligible to be part of some sort of carbon sequestration component or a management change. And in essence, the opportunity is huge. There are 400 million acres of cropland in the US that has potential to rebuild that soil organic carbon, sequester the atmospheric carbon, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So a pretty big opportunity. So then the question always becomes, how much carbon can my farm store? And the answer, of course, is that it depends. It depends so much on soil type, climate, topography, what type of crop is growing, and then residue and nutrient management activities. If we're thinking about no-till, a nuance or a very specific management factor that influences sequestration in no-till is the depth of previous tillage practices. And then on cover crops, it really depends on how many years have we been cover cropping, how long is that cover crop growing before we terminate it to plant our commercial crop, and then what kind of species are being used. So those are really, it's a wild west out there a little bit, and there is a little table that shows up the national range. Huge range. For no-till, it ranges from 0.03 metric tons per acre to 1.07 metric tons per acre. Cover crops have an even larger range here. So it's from like negative 0.03 to 1.5 metric tons per acre. Really wide range. And so again, this so much depends on your soil, your climate, precipitation, topography, et cetera. And again, the largest factors in both of those I listed there. For no-till, the largest factor is temperate locations and well-drained soils. They have the greatest potential. And for cover crops, the largest potential comes with temperate locations, fine textured soils, and mixed species plantings of cover crops. So just looking again at those two practices, if this is a very similar map, again, this is like potential metric tons of CO2 equivalent per acre, very generalized on a state by state basis. So super generalized. Want to just clarify that. So AFT through the CARPE tool, and Emily Bruner did a lot of this work and calculation with members of the climate team, looked at what are the acres that are available for no-till, looked at the soil type, estimated what the sequestration potential would be in those acres, and then generalized it for the whole state, took the average. So Ohio, I pulled out a few states where I think many of people on the call are located. Ohio has 0.64 metric tons per acre per year. Pennsylvania has 0.52 and Maryland has 0.51. So somewhere just a little bit over a half of a ton for no-till. Again, cover crops, similar method was used to come up with these amounts. In Ohio is 0.29, Pennsylvania 0.16, and Maryland 0.28 metric tons per acre per year, if it were to be implemented into cover crops. So really quick recap on where we are with CO2 potential. There is general consensus, even though there's a wide range, there's general consensus on that range. Like there's kind of this recognition that a lot of variables go into how much you can sequester, and there's agreement on what those variables are and how they influence, but not necessarily agreement on what that exact number is. And there are nearly 400 million acres again. So really a really large opportunity for agriculture to be part of a climate change, climate solution, and also to improve water quality, build soil health, improve that farm resiliency, et cetera. So my quick caveats here, a lot of this research has been done on the upper surface, 0 to 2, 0 to 8 inches of the soils. There's some questions and a lot of evolving research on what that looks like deeper in the soil profile. And then of course, these practices aren't necessarily permanent on the landscape. If you do no-till for 8 years and then you have to till for a year, well, what does that really mean for the carbon that you've captured thus far? But assuming that we can agree on something and we can create a market that we can sell, there are people interested in buying. I have 3 slides here. I'm going to breeze through these pretty quickly because you were given a resource document that goes into detail on all of these. But basically, there's a group, a bucket we're referring to as market entities. These are like the real estate agents. They don't have carbon to sell, and they don't have carbon to buy, but they connect the dots between the producers and the polluters, I guess. So these market entities: Nori, Indigo Ag, Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, and Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. Then there's a bucket of input providers, Bayer, Corteva, and Nutrien. These are companies that farmers are probably familiar with. They sell seed, fertilizer, whatever to farmers, and they're trying to incentivize and meet their sustainability goals as well. And in some cases, they are offsetting carbon within their own supply chain, or they're satisfying the buyers of that grain later in the supply chain. And I think in nutrient cases, they're actually not paying the farmer, they're actually giving the farmer a coupon or a credit for future purchase. And then there's entities that are kind of a hybrid. They're not necessarily the brokers or the input providers, but they are just using some innovative technology platforms to connect the dots. So we have SIBO, we have Gradable, which is the platform of Farmers Business Network, and then Truterra, True Carbon, which is affiliated with Land O'Lakes. So real quick recap on market opportunities: multiple entities with ecosystem market programs, diversity of players, variety of incentives, varied payment structures, different levels of technical support. So a whole lot of caveats here. The biggest one is that this is a rapidly changing landscape. Many of these entities have rolled out pilot phases in certain areas. Some of their pilot phases look different from one state to the next, and they're trying to figure out what that full program rollout might look like, and it could be very different than what the pilot phase was. There's also new partnerships forming all the time. Just 10 days ago or so, Indigo Ag announced a partnership with Corteva. So again, rapidly changing landscape, which leaves many farmers and all of us asking which program is right for me. So just to show this, and the answer, this is the answer that I feel is important that you all understand and farmers can feel comfortable with, is the answer that maybe none of them. Looking at this again, I put, this is just quick back of the envelope calculation for demonstration purposes. I feel like a pharmaceutical company, you know, back of envelope calculation for demonstration purpose only. This is not intended to represent what an individual farm could get. So again, just taking those state averages in Ohio of 0.64 tons per acre for no-till, and we multiply that by the average market value of a ton of carbon at $15, we get about $9.60 that a farmer could earn for converting to no-till. Pennsylvania, $7.80, and Maryland, $7.65. For comparison, EQIP payment rates are, you know, somewhere about double that for Ohio and Pennsylvania. And I didn't find a per acre rate for Maryland, but if there was one, I assume it would be in the similar ballpark. And then cover crops, again, you can see payment for on a pure carbon market would be somewhere between $2 and $4.35. If you look at the EQIP payment rates, you know, in Ohio, you can get about 9 times as much if you enroll in EQIP for your cover crops. And Pennsylvania and Maryland, you're getting somewhere, you know, 10 to 20 times the payment rate by pursuing EQIP funding for cover crops. So my takeaway is that market incentives alone are not the most cost-effective means to accelerate practice adoption. They're not sufficient to justify management changes for the typical farm, okay? And they're generally not competitive with existing financial incentives. However, they may be right for a farmer who's already planning to make this change, and it is possible most of the programs allow stacking. So you can get EQIP payment and your carbon market payment both. And so you can definitely increase your return on investment when those payments are stacked. And I think that that is kind of, if we think about these carbon markets as sort of gravy on top of what we're already doing, then I think it makes sense. So quickly, you know, last few minutes, just some advice for farmers. If you're talking with them or fielding questions from them, it's really important that they are realistic in terms of their goals and in terms of what they think can be sequestered, and also the management changes. All of this, again, that additionality thing, they're going to have to make some sort of management change. How much and how quickly can they make that management change? How much technical support is available? And I haven't even gotten into the pretty extensive record keeping that's required for a lot of these markets. And that could be a real challenge for many farmers. Additionally, advice for farmers and advice for professionals working with farmers and landowners: read the fine print. Always, there's a lot of questions here. Does enrollment in that carbon market limit your eligibility for Farm Bill or other financial incentives. Generally, you can do a private and a public. You can stack two sources of funding if they're private and public. You cannot stack private and private. So knowing the different sources of funding are important. The contract length and how long are we committed to this, and is there a penalty if we change it? Are rented lands eligible? Generally, yes. But then how is that program structured between the landowner and the farmer? This is a rapidly changing environment. The market prices are likely to change. Some people think they're going to go really high. If you does your contract allow you to take advantage of that if the price goes up? Is there volatility? What's the risk? And then again, privacy and data. What is happening to all of the farmer data that's provided to these entities? And then how is verification happening and who is paying for that verification? All of this are really nuanced things, vary from market to market, and really important questions. And ultimately, it comes down to making sure that there's transparency and trust with anybody that you're working with, a landowner. Obviously, you value your trust with your farmer, landowner, and connecting them with these market entities, making sure that you're not jeopardizing your trust and credibility by doing that. Red flags there, just wanting to make sure that everybody's aware of that. So a few resources to help you. AFT developed this Combating Climate Change on U.S. Cropland, which is the source of a lot of the slides I shared with you. And I gave you a 2-page summary. I believe a 2-page summary was actually provided to you, but the full report is available on the Farmland Information Center website. And then the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership developed webinars and resource materials. You received like a compilation of these different program matrix comparison tables and a little bit of background on the different programs. But also on ISAP's website, which is their ilsustainableag.org/ecomarkets, there are recordings of 8 different webinars that 5 webinars that we hosted. It was 8 hours of content highlighting these 12 market opportunities. So I encourage you to check those out or refer farmers who might have really specific questions about these different programs. And that brings me just to the end. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share this information, and acknowledgement to AFT and the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership for the work, and also my colleague, Emily Bruner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I want to begin by just underlining what Jean said about the document and the comparison table. So if you are in the Pathable platform and click on Files, it's right next to the Chat tab, you'll see the EcoMarkets program comparison. This is a great document to give to a farmer or landowner if they come to you and say, I've been hearing about these carbon markets, these ecosystem markets. What do you think? Should I go with one of them? This is a really nice side-by-side comparison. And I want to thank, again, Jean and her colleagues for putting that together. Let's take a moment for questions. Feel free to put your questions for Jean either in the chat, or even better, unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have. Sarah Kipp, I see your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. To the point that was made early on about how for there to be a improvement in carbon sequestration, it has to reflect a change in practices, which makes complete sense. I was wondering, does that, it seems like that would maybe actually encourage someone to possibly start using poor practices just so they would then become eligible for that change in practices. I want to know if that was ever a risk or observed in the real world. And because I feel like I've actually even heard of that happening for eligibility for CREP or something, like someone will actually farm marginal land just so they can then take their land out of farming to be eligible for programs like that. And I wonder if that was something that might possibly happen with that kind of, issue with the ecosystem markets.
So I did ask the presenters at one of our webinars that very question. Their response was that a lot of this is looking back, and they're looking at historical satellite imagery. They're, farmers sometimes need to provide 5 years of records in order to be eligible. So in theory, the answer is there's safeguards to prevent that. In reality and in practice, I would not be surprised if that's what's happening.
Thanks for your question, Sarah. Diana Griffith also has a hand raised.
All right, it's actually Allie who has a question.
Oh, great.
Thank you for that really informative presentation. Do you have any kind of profile similar to the economic case studies of farmers that were developed by American Farmland Trust that we could kind of provide to farmers in our area and say, like, yeah, here's a case study of someone who really liked their, and like how they navigated the carbon credit market?
We don't. That's actually a really good idea. I think the closest thing, again, if you go to the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnerships website, there's another fact sheet that kind of looked at the different payment rates again. So it would be very similar to the table that I shared in my presentation, just showing like, okay, this is what you might expect to earn through a carbon market, but this is what you might also expect to earn through some sort of EQIP or CSP payment. That's the closest that I have. It's a really good idea to think about like a case study and highlight some farmers who have gone through some of these markets. And also the lessons learned from farmers who are participating. It's so new, it's so early. There's a lot of unknowns yet, and I think it's evolving. And I've already said this is rapidly changing, but I think there is some people who are going to jump in really early and make a lot of money and be really happy. There's some people that are going to jump in really early, make a little bit of money, and then think, oh, that wasn't really worth it. And then there's going to be some people who jump in really early and then think, oh, never do that again, and all of that, communicating all of that, and kind of farmers learning from each other, I think it remains to be seen how it's actually going to, like, kind of when the dust settles, what is it really going to look like? Not to mention also that the whole USDA is also looking at like a carbon bank, that there's hope will actually address some of that additionality and not and allow for farmers who've been doing these practices for a long time to participate. But again, could be 2 years down the road, lots of decisions and lots of factors to be sorted out yet.
Pausing to see if anybody else has any additional questions. I have a question, probably mostly for our Ohio and Pennsylvania participants, maybe for Maryland. The question, or the point came up yesterday in our Ohio session that members of Amish or Plain communities rarely, if ever, use government programs like EQIP. I'm curious, for those of you in Ohio, Pennsylvania, who have landowners who are Amish or in Plain communities, could you imagine them participating in ecosystem service markets, or would they have the same hesitation with those? I see that Chris has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks. Sorry, I struggled to find my reactions tab this morning. 2 years in, still working on it. So I work as a staff liaison to a producer-led group. I work for a land trust, and so I engage with farmers, at least twice a month. And this has come up meeting after meeting after meeting. Should we do this? Should we do this? We're in Wisconsin. We don't have a lot of these brokerages available to us operating in Wisconsin. And so the discussion has come up multiple times. What would it take to create a brokerage from scratch, basically? What would it take to create a brokerage that is really tailored to our region specifically? And I like the context of this meeting being, the Chesapeake Bay area, watershed area. What would it take to really create a brokerage that really fits the Chesapeake Bay watershed, for example? as compared to relying on Indigo Ag or Nori to, we got to be flexible to fit what they present and make available to us. I know, and just a follow-up is that I know that the World Bank came out with like guidance for policymakers to develop carbon trading regulations and things like emissions trading regulations and things like that. I'm wondering if that goes into this at all.
I think, ultimately you need somebody who wants to buy those credits. So I think that's where the brokers are accelerating, or the input providers, because within their own system, within their own operation, they are hoping to offset those credits. So like, let's say you as a land trust in Wisconsin, somebody needs to be willing to pay the farmers to do what they're doing, and so I think that's really like the biggest hurdle in creating your own program. However, I've talked all about carbon, and I mentioned this in the beginning, like, we generalize this whole through carbon markets, but there are very real live examples, including in Wisconsin, of water quality markets that are happening. And in that case, the buyer is like the municipality who's drawing from that water for drinking water. And so it's actually cheaper to pay the farmers to keep the soil and keep the nutrients in the field and out of the water than it is to clean the water when it gets to the water plant, So there are examples like that, but really it comes down to whether you have a buyer for the market, for the credits. And then also, verification, I think that's a pretty big hurdle as well, is verifying and registering those markets and making sure it's all legitimate. Because I think, while my presentation maybe wasn't like all rosy about these markets, like, in many respects, they're not, the market price is not enough to really motivate a farmer or justify a farmer's effort yet. At the same time, I do think it's important that this is done successfully, because if agriculture and farmers don't take advantage of this or don't listen and pay attention, the boat will leave without them, and they'll look at some other way to address the whole climate, and these corporations will work with someone else to meet their sustainability goals. So there is an opportunity for farmers and agriculture and landowner to benefit from this whole process, and I think that's also important to recognize. So we want to make sure we're working with legitimate companies. We want to make sure we have legitimate programs rolling out.
Great. Well, Jean, your mention of water quality trading is a wonderful preview of our next session, where we're going to talk about precisely that. We're going to now change gears to Tyler Miller, and Tyler is going to talk with us about the Vermont Land Trust's Conservation Innovation Grant Program. So for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be hearing about that. Thanks, Tyler.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here. Yeah, so as Kara says, I'm going to give a bit of a case study. So I work for Vermont Land Trust, so it's a statewide nonprofit that we work closely with our state partners and some local partners. But our core work over time has been acquiring conservation easements on all lands, but particularly on farmlands. Vermont's been a great place to do farmland conservation and stewardship work over there. There's a lot of public support, private and public financing. And it's been really successful. And as we think about how do we have a positive impact around soil health, ecosystem services, and sort of land restoration, we've really been kind of trying to focus on what is a unique value add for us as a land trust. Like, there's some things we're good at, there's some things we're not good at. What kind of partnerships could come together? And so really that's what this case study is about. So I'm gonna share my screen. So before I get into the project, we thought it might be good just for me to spend a minute on, like, why would we do this? As a land trust, we kind of have a lane, maybe we know what that lane is. Is this jumping out of the lane or not? So I'll spend a minute just kind of talking about that and then get into the specifics. So we're really seeing kind of soil health initiatives in general as kind of a next phase in the evolution of our programming. like I said, we've been around about 45 years, have conserved somewhere around 1,000 farms in Vermont, about 20% of the open farmland base of the state. So great success there. That was the sort of core point of the first phase of the program. Acquire these easements and make sure the land is available. As time went on, we really started to branch into more program around viability. Okay, the land is open, but how do we make sure it's accessible, available for new and beginning farmers at affordable levels? And really, how do we help contribute to sort of broader farm viability? So we've built some programming around that over the last couple of decades of farmland access, affordability tools. As time has gone on, sort of thinking about farms' roles in ecosystem health across Vermont. There's, like a lot of places, we have some water quality challenges and some general kind of land use challenges, particularly in a changing climate where Vermont's getting wetter and that rain is coming in shorter bursts. And so building some programming around restoration and really thinking about how to have farms be not just like meeting regulatory compliance, but sort of like building that into their overall viability. And so really with soil health, these things kind of all come together. So there's a piece around farm viability, there's a piece around the perpetuation of farmland being farmed, and there's a piece around around sort of broader ecological health goals. And so we got really excited about that and realized we wanted to be really active in that space. And in the next session, we talk a little bit about, what that can look like in an easement context, but broadly for us, it's outside of an easement context. And so what we have been doing for the last few years is developing a partnership with a couple of entities, the University of Vermont and this private farm consultation group, Biological Capital, to come up with a way to really launch a larger soil health sort of payment for practices program in Vermont. And that culminated last year with we put in a proposal for a conservation innovation grant from USDA, a newer version of that program, or newer subset of that program, which is on farm trials. And so, as Jean kind of mentioned, there's quite a bit that's unknown around certain practices, certainly in Vermont. So we were identifying the need. One, we want to, before these marketplaces are well established, just kind of like everybody wants to be active and doing this. And so we're really thinking about, we're being in a pilot phase here. So we identified this funding source as an opportunity to get a lot of financial incentive payments out to farmers across the landscape of Vermont, and to really do a bunch of research to try to answer some of those more specific questions. How much carbon is really stored on a particular farm with a particular soil profile, et cetera, et cetera. So we put together a project proposal, and it was accepted, and we're sort of in the early phases of getting that going. And so yeah, I'll talk a little bit about it. So it's called Managing Pasture for Healthy Farms and Soils across Vermont. So as I mentioned, it's a partnership between us, Biological Capital, which is a consultation firm. They do sort of financial planning and modeling for farms, particularly around kind of value-added agriculture, but they also have a ecological research wing. And then the University of Vermont, both the research and classic extension technical assistance components. So us together, we're embarking now on this project that it kind of does two main things. So it incentivizes a suite of management-intensive rotational grazing practices around a lot of farms. Vermont's a great place to grow grass. It's a great place to graze animals. And there's just some persistent sort of particularly financial barriers, but some management barriers to around, the transition from either, continuous pasture to management-intensive pasture, or some of the add-on practices that can enhance that system. So the idea is to exceed EQIP payments and/or private market payments at this point. Really, so we built a model that suggested, like, preliminarily, what would be a payment level, sort of a public payment level that would like actually meet a financial need for a farmer around these practices to both implement and sustain the practices over time. So that's kind of the basis of the payment. And then this project over a 5-year period. We'll test those assumptions. And then, coming behind that, as farmers implement these practices, having a robust sort of ecological and financial research component behind that to see what exactly changes over a 5-year period as we move from either row crops or continuous pasture to this management intensive grazing setup. So we'll do that with 16 to 20 farms across the state, looking at a couple specific soil profiles and a couple of landscape contexts. And what we're going to get up to is this 4-part system, things that probably are very familiar to this group. So no-till seeding of forage and cover crops into pasture, nutrient management, particularly compost and some organic additions, really thinking about very targeted ways to do that. Mechanical pasture improvement, really subsoiling, key line, some kind of key, decompaction strategies on particular parcels, especially where a long tenure of heavy equipment had been used in previous cycles. And then a management intensive rotational grazing, many paddock system. So the idea is to aggregate these things and then study their cumulative impact. And so what we'll be doing is, and what's cool about this particular CIG, right, is like sort of thinking about ecological health, financial health, and social health at the same time. And so there's a component of each of those. So we'll be, measuring these impacts, and particularly storage of carbon and storage of water and macronutrients. Those would be the big ones, but also microbial activity. How does that change? How does it change over time? At the same time, be looking at really what we're trying to contribute to is this body of work that's happening. This project, several others happening, in and around Vermont, just around what would it really take for these practices to not become innovative, but to become normal. And so really looking at financial costs versus return on an investment kind of metrics, and what can a payment like this do to get you from red to black. Like I said, understanding sort of limited social outcomes. So particularly just like, how does this change the farm's operation, the way the farm families function? Like, what does it mean about their time and their labor needs? And how does that make the whole systems work? And then in the end, gathering this data and try to use to build something of a predictive model to say, okay, we've tightened the range on like how much carbon gets stored in these contexts on these soil types. Can we project where this transition could be the most successful, both for carbon storage and financial outcomes for farms over time? And then ultimately to, I think, make the case to policymakers and potentially to private capital that, increasing the payment to get us to a level of financial sustainability is where we all want to head. And like having some sidebars around that I think is what's missing for us now. So that's the goal. We're in the early phases of it, so we're still sort of getting the sites set up and getting some technical assistance out on the ground. So very exciting, very formative, and in a really new space for us to be in. So I will pause there, so we have time for some questions.
Thanks so much, Tyler. Questions from anyone? Oh, I just saw a hand. Chris Coffin.
That is. So I have a question that is both for Jean and Tyler, because I'm curious, Tyler, thinking about pasture, since this is all pasture, whether there is any private market now for pasture related practices. Jean didn't talk about it, which suggests to me that there's not. I do know that there has been for rangeland, right, or for kind of plains states, there have been payments for basically not sod busting. So the question is whether for the eastern part of the US, is there something comparable now in the private market arena?
I'll respond based on my interaction with these different market entities. The answer is that they're developing it. The challenge is that the models in terms of sequestering carbon and all that just aren't as dialed in on pasture lands. But there is a recognition, of course, that well-managed pasture does have the ability to increase, to capture carbon in the soil, and it also has the ability for water quality credits. So it's a little bit more of it's even more in an infancy than carbon markets are on corn and soybean lands. And I think my understanding from these different market entities is that there's just this really big focus on corn and soybeans because there's just these really large swaths of corn and soybean land in the US, and they're just kind of low-hanging fruit basically at this point. So I do expect, especially as the markets mature, I do expect more opportunities to be available for pasture, rangeland, even like agroforestry or riparian buffer areas, kind of things like that are all still being developed.
Yeah, that is part of how we came to choose this. One is that Vermont doesn't really grow corn and soy all that well. Like we do it, river bottoms and whatnot, but it's really a hay and pasture landscape to a large extent. And so one, trying to drive toward probably the best systems that we can have in ag land, but then also to try to hopefully this project supplies some data to that development process over time, because it is missing or lacking right now.
I wanted to hop in right here and share, this is Michelle Perez, Water Initiative Director, and just share two messaging ideas for the FRPP representatives if they're faced with Nancy Kipp, or perhaps I got your first name wrong, but who said, what do you do with farmers who are, upset about being excluded from the markets and who are threatening to plow up for the first time their no-till fields or stop growing cover crops? And one suggestion is, gently challenge, well, why would you do that? You're a believer, or that person is a believer in all of these amazing soil health benefits that they've likely benefited economically from all of these many years that they've made that commitment to soil health. So why would they do that? Do you think they'll really do that? And do you think that the prices in the marketplace right now warrant the loss of all of that investment in soil health? And to use the analogy from Bianca, to hear the screams of all of those underground livestock, would they really do that? Is that a concern? And then the other side of the other suggestion I wanted to offer is, we heard in our Pennsylvania session that they can only meet 1/4 of the requests for financial assistance, that is NRCS, federal financial assistance programs. And then just recently, IATP came out with a report saying only that 67% of farmers are shut out of the financial programs. So perhaps, even though at the moment the prices in these marketplaces aren't as high as the available financial assistance programs, they're actually not that available. And so you're dealing with farmers and landowners who are hopefully interested and receptive to your suggestion that they do more for soil health, but they need the financial assistance. So maybe after all, those at the moment lesser prices in the ecosystem services markets could be considered attractive. So I just wanted to offer up those two alternative perspectives, different ways to engage and talk to your farmers and landowners. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle. Great points. Tyler, could you talk a little bit about the process of developing the Conservation Innovation Grant application? And is it just Vermont Land Trust, or are there other co-applicants or co-partners?
Yeah, sure. So we're kind of the lead applicant on that, and then we have the University of Vermont and Biological Capital as participants. In the end, it sort of structurally functions as their contractors, but really they're just, it's a three-way partnership in reality. So we did spend a long time sort of like figuring out how to partner together. Probably could have spent longer, really sort of figuring out, but really around, a strengths and opportunities kind of exercise. The application itself, the process was, like about what you'd expect from an NRCS program, like pretty rigorous, but like pretty intuitive at the same time. And so, yeah, I think the trick was, I think, for us to come up with a project, there's like a much bigger idea behind this project, right? That couldn't fit with it. So coming up with a scale that could do some good on the ground, but then also wasn't overly ambitious. It's a 5-year project. It's a significant amount of funding, but it's like not as much as you probably need. And then thinking about how to do some private fundraising around it to be able to expand it slightly beyond its original scope is where we're at now. And then it creates an interesting opportunity, so we partner with the NRCS, a state office, really close around like ASAP and, the easement side of the things. And then obviously, some of the EQIP programs as well. But this offers a new opportunity to partner in an interesting and somewhat innovative way with the local NRCS staff around. Very intensive look at a small number of farms. So in a way, NRCS is like a fourth partner in this project, which is exciting.
Are you finding that the farms that you are working with or thinking of working with to adopt managed rotational grazing, are those farms with easements or not necessarily?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I meant to mention that we made a really strategic choice to not to have it be open to all farms in Vermont. Really wanted this to be a program that it was available to everyone. So in the end, we have a strong base relationships with owners of conserved land. So it's disproportionately conserved land, but probably of the 20, maybe 20% of the 20 are unconserved properties. The kinds of investments and long-term strategies, that you need to implement as part of these larger systems really like pair well with long-term conservation, of course. But that's also a new space for us to try to work really intentionally with some owners of unconserved land.
Thanks. Catherine, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, you said that was very intentional, and I was wondering to what extent it was a strategy to engage with non-eased landowners in a hopes to bring them into the fold so that they'll be interested in protecting their land.
Yeah, I think to the extent that happens, that's great. And we'd be like hopeful some of that can happen. It's also, I think, just after we've been at this for a long time now, and we just realized there's a subsection of the farm community that's never going to conserve their land. And so like what can we do to help their viability and sustainability and really move the needle on soil health and ecological integrity, instead of like waiting for them to change their mind about easements, so to speak. So in a way, it's just a way to be more relevant to a bigger subset of the farm community. That's probably the biggest goal.
Fantastic. Well, I feel like I have a number of other questions, but I want to respect our timeline here, and we're exactly at the time that we should be.